Hi, my name is Ed Poole. I'm a political activist and I've been talking to people on the left to find out what they're about. Today, I'm talking to Dave Nellist, who is the National Chair of the Trade Union and Socialist Coalition and also a former Labour MP. Hi, Dave.
Hi, Ed. Thanks for inviting me.
It's a pleasure. So what is the Trade Union and Socialist Coalition?
Well, it's a bit like what it says on the tin, really. We're a coalition of trade unionists and socialists. We were formed 11 years ago, January 2010. And we'd had a period by then of 13 years of Labour government. And Bob Crow, who was then the leader of the transport union, the RMT, called two conferences in 2009 to discuss what his union described as the crisis of political representation for working people. I spoke at both those conferences on behalf of the Socialist Party, and we were in debate at the first one in February with John McDonnell, and at the last one in November with Jeremy Corbyn. So we had a debate of socialists inside and outside the Labour Party is what was needed. And TUSC was formed, as I say, in January in order to build a new political voice for working people that was rooted in the organisations and communities of the working class. And we had quite a successful 5-year up to 2015. We were the sixth biggest party in the country in electoral terms in 2015, standing 135 parliamentary candidates and 619 council candidates. But then Jeremy got elected in September 2015. We recalibrated, we pulled back from the general election challenges of 2017 and 2019, and we only stood in a limited number of council elections against out-and-out right-wing, pro-austerity cutters of local services. The Keir Starmer's election a year ago, the 4th of April, that's changed. We had a conference in February this year, and we've relaunched and are standing quite widely in the May elections this year.
Okay. So what does Trade Union Socialist Coalition stand for?
Well, firstly, I would advise people to go to www.tusk.org.uk to look at it all. But what you'll see most of in the May elections, certainly in England, are the policies as they pertain to austerity and local services, because it's the council elections. So we are standing in every region in Wales and in, I think it's 3 regional lists in Scotland, and they have wider responsibilities. So, for example, the Scottish Parliament controls NHS and pay and things like that. So there are different policies in those places. We're also standing for the London Assembly and for 2 mayoral elections in Bristol and in Liverpool. And again, the policies will be more specific depending on the contest and then depending where. But essentially, we're an anti-austerity coalition that wants to see socialist alternatives put forward, opposed to privatisation, in favour of public ownership, and wanting to change the agenda of the last 40 years, where the income of working people has been stolen by a major and massive transfer of wealth in this country towards a very tiny number at the top. Something perhaps we can talk in more detail later on. But we're an anti-austerity coalition. We're against cuts in services. In councils, for example, we campaign against closure of libraries, of community centres, of youth centres, of street cleaners. In councils, in the last 10 years, we've lost now an annual £15 billion that we did have 10 years ago. We've lost 750,000 jobs, and we fight against those cuts.
Okay, great. So as an organisation, it's a bit unusual, isn't it? Who's in charge?
Well, in one sense, the smallest vote on our steering committee has the largest influence, because we operate by means of consensus, which gives every member of the steering committee a veto. So we don't proceed beyond which we have agreement on. The steering committee consists of members of the National Executive of the RMT, at this stage the only union that's fully affiliated with TUSC. We have 1 member from the Socialist Party on the steering committee, 2 from Resist, which is the organisation which Chris Williamson, the former Labour MP from Derby North, has formed, and is, as he would describe it, a movement towards a People's Party. We also have an elected representative from the individual non-aligned socialists. So that's people who aren't members of the Socialist Party or of Resist. They have a rep on the steering committee. And then we have a number of senior national figures from trade unions. But at this stage, they're there in a personal capacity. So we have President of USDOR, we have and have had assistant general secretaries of one or two unions. We have reps from the NECs of the NEU, the PCS, the UCU, and the probation union NAPO. So that's the steering committee. But we have in normal terms, we have monthly meetings, proposals are put, and the only things that go forward are ones which get unanimous support, because any one of those, for example, if we had, as we have had in recent months, a number of candidates coming forward for election, it would only take one vote on the steering committee to say, I'm not sure about that, a person representing TUSC as a whole should go forward, and we wouldn't have given authorization. It's very rare. It's not happened this round at all.
Okay. So in terms of standing in councils and so on, obviously you'd like to win seats and things, but in general, what are the aims of TUSC?
The overall and long-term aim is to build a new independent political voice, socialist voice for working people, but one that unashamedly is rooted, I'm repeating myself already, in the organisations and the communities of the working class. And our particular contribution to that is to not let pro-austerity, pro-establishment politicians have a free run at election times, because we think they should face a challenge. If we weren't standing in 100 towns, cities and counties in this election, in many of those areas, you would have virtual unanimity between the main parties, Tory, Labour and Liberal Democrat, on the necessity for the continuation of austerity, and no challenge for local people to that narrative. We at least, with our very modest resources, I mentioned earlier on, in 2015, we were the sixth biggest party in the country in terms of standing, 750 candidates. We had 5 years to build that. We had a conference in February this year and had effectively 5 weeks to build this challenge, but still, we've got 330 candidates on May the 6th. I suspect we may be the sixth biggest party, or even the fifth biggest party in England, when you add up those candidates. It's not insignificant, but we will get virtually no mainstream publicity. In 2015, we were allowed one-party political broadcast, and I had a couple of interviews, one with Andrew Neil when he was still working for the BBC, a couple of national radio ones. None of that this time, because we don't meet the threshold of the broadcasters for coverage. Locally, we'll get that. On Tuesday, I'm doing a thing for my local BBC radio station. Other candidates will do the same. So we have a much more limited reach, but where we can, we're arguing against the continuation of austerity. And in particular, we think councils should be fighting the Tories for more money. In the autumn statement that Rishi Sunak did in November, the Tory leaders of the Local Government Association, recognising that the budgets of local councils around the country now are about 15 billion less than they were in real terms 10 years ago, asked Rishi Sunak for £8.9 billion. He said, you can have £2.2 billion. I'll give you 600 million in cash, and you can raise the other 1.5 billion by putting the council tax up by 5%, which just raises more cuts to working people's living standards. There isn't what they could be, a conference of Labour authorities coming together and saying, this is what we've lost, this is what local people need. This is a weak Tory government that's been forced into 22 U-turns so far, at least 2 of them by a single footballer. We're going to launch a national campaign for better funding for essential local services. And they could have pushed hard in the last 12 months, but there's nothing. So our aim is to get these ideas into the electoral process. There's no need for a cut. We're a rich country. We are the 5th or 6th richest country in the world. When Jeremy put forward a manifesto in 2017 and 2019 that various people costed at 80 billion, Theresa May said you need a magic money tree to afford that. Rishi Sunak has committed us to 400 billion during the pandemic. It isn't a question of there's not money for local services. It's that there isn't a big enough campaign from the existing political layer to try and get some of that money back.
Definitely. So do you see the role of TUSC as to lobby for policy change from Labour and from the other mainstream parties, or are you going to try expecting or hoping to win seats as well? Which what's the kind of...
Well, we have won the odd seat in the past, and I'm being nothing more than honest. We've actually had more elected representatives in TUSC from people who've been expelled from Labour, who then have joined in with the project that we've got of creating this wider coalition and carried on their term in office. So in places like Southampton and Warrington, Leicester, and one or two other places as well. In the past, we've had elected representatives who've worked with TUSC. But as I say, with 5 weeks to get up and running and launch the campaign, with virtually no resources at this stage, we will be putting a marker down and saying this is what ought to be done, rather than expecting a wide range of seats. And in any case, even if in Coventry we're standing 13 candidates in a city with 18 wards, only a third of the candidates come up every year. Even if we won all 13, we still wouldn't have enough on a council to make a difference. Now, in Coventry, we've got a bit of a tradition. I was a independent socialist councillor for 14 years, and we had a group of 3 over that period. At times, we held the balance of power for a couple of years. So there were some decisions where we did have a big impact. But in these elections, it's basically trying to say austerity isn't necessary. There should be a fight about here's our ideas. Do you fancy joining us and helping build a bigger challenge in the next year or two? So it's a putting a marker down.
Okay. So obviously there's a lot that's happened over the last year or year and a half in terms of the left and what's going on. There's all sorts of organisations popping up in the kind of wake of Jeremy Corbyn standing down as leader of the Labour Party. How do you approach working with others and the issue of unity on the left, which is not something we're traditionally very good at?
Well, I don't think a new socialist party to challenge in a serious way the existing political structures, particularly the Labour Party, is going to come through the arithmetic growth one by one of the existing socialist parties, including my own. I think we are going to have to develop on a federal coalition basis of bringing people together, but that we could and would get an acceleration if one or more other unions than the RMT so far were to reach that same decision. Now, my own union, Unite, has reduced its affiliation money to the Labour Party, and Lenny McCluskey last summer in, I think it was Guardian magazine interview, talked about a conference of left unions and of socialists, bringing them together. And I would personally argue that's urgently needed. In the 12 months since Keir Starmer was elected on the 4th of April last year, 100,000 people have resigned from the... You're not alone, by the way, Ed. 100,000 former Labour Party members aren't. They were inspired by Jeremy and they're dismayed by Keir Starmer. And I don't like the idea that a good chunk of those are going to give up the idea of political change, because they may have seen, in my view, wrongly, that the particular 5 years, 4.5 years of Jeremy was the beginning and the end of a process. It was a stage along the way. So coalition is necessary. In this particular electoral challenge, it's not just the Socialist Party. We have Resist, Chris Williamson's organisation that he founded after he was disgracefully forced to or refused to stand as a Labour candidate in Derby North. In previous elections, we worked with Left Unity and had joint candidates with Left Unity. Before this round of elections, we wrote to the Communist Party and said, we've worked together, for example, on the EU in the past. You're talking this time round about standing some candidates. Is there a possibility we could stand separately, but under some common umbrella that meant we maximised the position of the left? When the Hartlepool by-election came up, I had conversations with the Socialist Labour Party councillors in Hartlepool to say, are you considering standing a candidate? If so, can we have a discussion? When the 3 Labour nominees were scrapped by Labour in Liverpool, and Anna Rothery in particular, an open Jeremy Corbyn supporter, was at one point, we thought, thinking of standing as an independent. Then Tusk wrote to Anna Rothery to see if there was a way we could work there. And in fact, Anna took a legal challenge, which disgracefully cost her, I think, about £60,000 the Labour Party is chasing her for, and has decided not to stand. So Tusk does have a candidate for the Liverpool mayor. But before we stand any candidates, particularly in local elections, we've written to, for example, Labour candidates saying, look, we want to see a fight against austerity. If there was further austerity cuts coming in the budget, normally in the February of each year, on your council, would you be openly voting against them in the council chamber? And if we've got somebody saying, yes, I'm against austerity, then we wouldn't stand against them. We're actually trying to maximise the position of opposition to austerity, not create a moral high ground by saying we're the only people that are making this opposition. So yes, we would work with others. And Tusk has a programme that's deliberately set. I mean, there's 8 demands, central demands in this council election, at a level at which almost any socialist can agree with. Opposition to privatisation, bringing things back in-house, building more social housing, not making cuts, arguing with the government for more money, fairly simple things. And then any candidate for Tusk is allowed to augment their election campaign with anything that doesn't conflict with those basic points. And therefore, in Coventry, one of our candidates has been the leading person for the last 5 years, arguing against library closures, and that will be her thing. Tusk doesn't have a separate policy within those 8 of opposing library closures, but we have candidates on who will be prioritising that. We have candidates from the NHS Pay 15% Now, leading candidates from that movement who will prioritise that. So our programme is designed to give us the basis of the maximum unity, whilst allowing socialists of different traditions to argue their own particular priorities.
Kind of on that, I guess, I was going to ask you your position on a few things. Some of them are easy, some of them are things that are quite divisive on the left. And I guess your personal position, Tusk's position, Socialist Party's position, whatever you think is kind of relevant. So the first one is easy one, public ownership. How do you feel about public ownership?
Definitely in favour. Against privatisation, against PFI, which now has about 700 projects around the country, started by a Tory Chancellor, accelerated by Tony Blair, my former office mate, to the point where we have over 100 hospitals in hock to PFI schemes that can rest, like the one in Coventry, 35 years long. Half of them now have been relocated overseas to tax havens, so not even paying proper tax in this country. So we would argue that we want a government to reverse privatisation, to increase public ownership, particularly of the essentials that Jeremy again raised in 2017 and 2019, things like energy and water, transport, Royal Mail. But we would go further and say that if you're going to run an economy in a fair way, you have to have finance, like banks, pensions and insurance, under a democratic control, not just there for the making of profit for major shareholders. So that's, again, I don't think out of the mainstream of the left, and something which, as I say, is at the core of Tusk's opposition to the present system.
So this one can be a bit thornier. What about the EU? How do you feel about the EU?
Well, it's not, as Michael Caine would have said, not a lot of people know this, but there were actually 3 official Leave campaigns in the referendum in 2013. One obviously led by Johnson and Gove, one led by Farage, but the third one, which was recognised by the Electoral Commission, was Tusk's. Though when they finally made the decision on which one was to get the authority in the public finance, we were well down the list. Our opposition to the EU, rooted like Tony Benn's and Bob Crow's, was a socialist internationalist opposition, It was the lack of democracy and the accelerating neoliberalism in what I used to call, Thatcherism on a continental scale. So some of those indices we've just mentioned for public ownership, the impetus, if not in every case, firstly in Britain, certainly in a number of other European countries, for their privatisation, came from directives of the EU. So there are 4 transport directives which have said that all EU countries have to effectively privatise the railways. There were directives on water, directives on liberalisation of energy. One of the most recent ones was on public procurement, where the rules at the moment are that when Britain was a member of the EU, that any council contract of over, I think it's £150,000, had to be advertised to multinational firms across the whole of the EU, and you weren't allowed, for example, to set conditions on fair pay, fair recruitment, trade union membership, and all the other things, which, if a contract does have to go outside a local authority, any trade unionist would want to have some restrictions on the way it was operated. So our opposition to the EU was the lack of control on those basic things, but it was also an international thing. You're not going to solve things like climate change or other world issues by ever retreating behind national borders. But the sort of international structures that we have, we think should start with working people and working class organisations, not things be decided between the governments at a national level with very little democratic accountability and control. So that was then. If I'm allowed just one more minute on it, because you're right, It's a big question, but we've moved on from there. And now what we have to argue is, which we have done for many years, our international approach and links, and how you then bridge that divide between people who voted to leave and voted to remain. It's not a perfect example, but it's not a bad one. I mean, Jeremy did it in 2017. In 2017, Jeremy got the largest rise in Labour's vote since Clem Attlee in 1945. 3.5 million extra people voted Labour in 2017. 1 million of those were ex-UKIP voters. So to win ex-UKIP voters, you don't have to wrap yourself in a Union Jack. You have to put forward class policies about housing, about free education, about funding the NHS and local services. And it's those class issues that then reunite people who may have had a division in the previous discussions about the EU. And that will be our position here today.
Right. Talk about trans rights as something that's can be a bit divisive on the left. What's your thoughts?
Well, like a number of issues, TUSC doesn't have a fully worked out position on everything. We have, for example, in this election, the statement that we're opposed to all forms of oppression and discrimination. And we have in the previous national elections the statement that we're in favour of full equality for LGBT people. That's where we start from. But as I say, we're all socialists in TUSC, and as far as the Socialist Party is concerned, we have 100% support for the defence of trans people's rights, including self-identity, and therefore our candidates in this election, and we have probably the largest number of that 300 would be fully in defence of the rights of trans people.
Okay. What's your position on? I remember when people were leaving the Labour Party and talking about joining the Green Party. Somebody from the Green Party made a comment that suggested that people leaving the Labour Party might not be welcome. What's your position on former members expelled from the Labour Party for anti-Semitism?
Well, in the vast majority of cases, I suspect, with no direct evidence on each and every one case, that it's probably trumped up, because I've seen so many. Let's take Chris Williamson for a prime example. Chris said the Labour Party is a historically, I'm paraphrasing, right, historically excellent anti-racist record, and we've been a bit too soft when people accuse us of anti-Semitism. We should come out and fight and so on. He gets expelled. I mean, so yes, he's welcome in TUSC. Obviously, any genuine and proven anti-Semitic utterances would not be welcome, because I suspect there will be at least one, if not many on the steering committee, which would exercise a right of veto. But there are loads and loads of people who have been expelled from Labour or suspended from Labour for the interpretation internally without public accountability of a social media post of 3 years ago, etc. So I don't start from the premise that people are being expelled from Labour. It's necessarily because they've done something wrong. I think it's more to do with the changing direction and structure within the Labour Party. And although I didn't read all 850 pages of that report about 18 months ago, I did read a good chunk of it, at least probably about half of it, and it was horrific what was going on inside the Labour Party, the way in which people were being pilloried and portrayed. And in my experience, and I was a member of the Labour Party for nearly, what was it? I forget myself now, nearly 30 years, and still kept a lot of contact. I didn't see on the ground the sort of expressions of anti-Semitism that the press were portraying. And what I find most amazing, I'll finish on this point, I forget the exact date of the election in 2019, but let's assume it was, I don't know, whenever, December 15th or something. From December the 16th onwards, the BBC stopped leading the 6 o'clock and 10 o'clock news with the latest story of what Jeremy has apparently done on the question of anti-Semitism. It was a tool that was used to discredit Jeremy in particular, because he was a challenge, a radical challenge to the establishment and the current way in which the economy is being run, and it was weaponized to be used against him. I repeat, any genuine expression of anti-Semitism, like other forms of racism, is to be condemned and to be dealt with. But in terms of the Labour Party, there was much more to it than that. It was a tool of the establishment in which a lot of Labour MPs were complicit because they wanted to get rid of Jeremy and radical socialism, not really to deal with any questions of oppression or racism.
Okay, so just to follow up a little bit on that, do you think it was, I mean, it was clearly an effective tool in terms of to attack Corbyn with. It became the thing that the papers ran with, and that even the Conservative Party and people like that ran with. Do you think it was effective? Why do you think it was effective? What do you think made that stick where other things perhaps didn't stick?
Well, okay, I think from 2015 onwards that Jeremy and John did a good job with portraying radical policies and changing Labour's attitude on public ownership and some other things, but I think they failed on radical organisation, particularly by not bringing in mandatory reselection for MPs, which already exists for councillors, for shop. I mean, every shop steward has to be elected every 1 or 2 years. Every councillor in the Labour Party has to come up for election every 4 years. Every general secretary of a union has to be elected legally every 5 years. MPs think they've got a job for life, and 80% of the MPs were hostile to Jeremy, and as I say, in many cases complicit in using that particular issue to beat him with. And if there'd been the same change in the democratisation of the Labour Party in organisational terms, as he was moving on in political terms, that could have undermined that. But by not doing that, those people are all left in place. So there was a power base for the accusations against, and it started off, didn't it? You know, can't tie his tie, can't sing the words of the national anthem. He's a Czech agent. He's a Russian. He's under the influence of Russia, or what have you. And then once they found an issue which the press and the media were almost unanimous in pursuing, then for a couple of years that became the prime weapon, and it should have been rejected, like Chris tried to reject it. And I repeat, if the organisational changes had been taken place and there had been a much more widespread refreshing of the parliamentary Labour Party, then Jeremy may have had more people to support him. But unfortunately, that didn't take place.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm trying to get at is, do you think the reason that was the thing that stuck, rather than him being a Russian agent or something else, was because, at least in the media or somewhere, or perhaps in reality there was more merit to that than other than other things that were thrown at him. So, for example, do you think there's one of the things that I've kind of noticed on from conversations with people, particularly on social media, is some of the language people use can be quite ambiguous and can be perhaps convey things they don't necessarily intend, but can look from the eyes of somebody looking for anti-Semitism, for example, can look like examples of anti-Semitism. So, for example, I'll give an example: the portrayal of Israel as the driver behind sort of British foreign policy and British American policy can look like anti-Jewish conspiracy theories.
There's an element to that, and similarly, if you describe Israel as an apartheid state, you get said that's the same thing. But anybody who looked at how Bantustans operated in South Africa and looks at the war between Palestine and Israel, the controls of people going to work and so on, couldn't fail to think there was parallels between the structure of the state in South Africa and the structure of the state in Israel, Palestine. But if the press was serious about this, they would subject to the same examination the Tory party and Islamophobia, which they never do. So it does come down to be not that there are serious merits in the argument. I think the actual number of cases which have gone through the Labour Party procedure, I don't know. I'm not party to it. It's in hundreds. It's not in millions. And yet this is a party with 500,000 membership. So even if there are some of them, and if they were proven they should be dealt with, I still say it was because it was a weapon which the press felt able to throw at Corbyn in a serious way. And I still think Chris is right that Labour, and now I must be including Jeremy in this, should have responded far more robustly to say that. Who are you to say that Labour's racist or anti-Semitism? We've got the record as a Labour and trade union movement of being the best fighters in society for equality of treatment and opposition to discrimination and so on. But regretfully, I think they went on the back foot, and the establishment got confidence from that and pursued the argument, not because there was fundamentally merit in the numbers or in the points that have been said.
Okay. So a couple of other things. One of the things that's come up recently is the issue of northern independence. How do you feel about that?
Well, I was born and brought up 13 miles down the coast from Hartlepool, right? But I was the wrong side of the Tees to be directly involved in what was going on the Durham side. Again, it'll sound like a cop-out, but there is no TUSC position on northern independence. But as a socialist and a member of the Socialist Party, I would advocate, or rather, let's phrase that better. I would defend the right to self-determination, where there's a clear wish amongst working people to have that, but I don't advocate it. So in Scotland, candidates for TUSC will be supporting independence, but with the qualification of it's got to be economic independence, not just constitutional independence. And if I was to paraphrase, because I'll never get the quotes right, but James Connolly, 8 years ago, in the debate about Irish independence, famously said that if you hoist the green flag over Dublin Castle, England will still rule you through her banks. And the point is that a constitutional change that says that north of the Humber River, a different flag or a different, or even a different democracy and so on exists, is not going to make a material change to people's lives unless the economic power to deliver those changes is there as well. So for me, it isn't independence of any group that's the prime thing to start with. It's how do we get economic independence, and to do that, if we want to plan a rich economy for the majority of people, then you can only plan things that you control, and you only control things that you own. So public ownership, particularly banks, finance, but also big companies, has to be the bottom line for any group of working class people to be able to determine their future.
Okay.
That said, by the way, just to put it on the record, as I say, we did contact the SLP in Hartlepool. We do have a statement on our website, because once we've been in touch with Thelma, and she said that she was Thelma Walker standing in the by-election in Hartlepool, given her record within the Labour Party as a parliamentary private secretary to John, and somebody who resigned from Labour over its treatment of Jeremy. We wish her well in the election, and if she's successful, we would look forward to working with her as we try and build this much wider coalition.
Okay, so my internet's gone a bit strange there. Hopefully, I think we've got all the sound. I don't know if we've got all the picture. It's gone. Okay. It's fine now that interrupted. Okay, so a bit of an old-fashioned one, but I guess people call it old-fashioned, but something that I think is quite useful for getting a handle on where people on the left are coming from. What do you feel about class?
Well, I think the working class is the source of the majority of wealth within society, but the ruling class makes sure that it takes a disproportionately large share. There is a class divide within society, and I think most issues are best looked at through the prism of all the spectacles or what have you of class. I think that when it comes to life expectancy, the poorer you are, the more manual, low-paid occupations you are, the shorter your life expectancy. That housing and education, which are fundamental starting points in life, are worse for millions of people, and therefore it's an uphill struggle. If I was to paraphrase the English Civil War, people like Winstanley and the Levellers and the Ranters and so on, they saw the world in terms of a pyramid, with the family at the royal family at the top, the aristocracy, the landowners, coming down to the vast majority of ordinary people at the bottom. And one of their slogans was turn the world upside down. And that's what I'd do as well, put the vast majority of people, the working class, in charge of society. And certainly the billionaires and the millionaires who currently have the influence at the moment should be sidelined. So yes, I look at things in class terms, and I want the majority of people, the working class, to be the ones that control society.
Okay, great. Just pointing out my Levellers thing in the background.
Oh, yeah, sorry, I can see that now.
So how do you feel about Black Lives Matter, the movement?
Well, I mean, it's a tragedy that it took a death in terms of George Floyd for it to erupt, but it was an enormously positive, angry, young movement that erupted around the world as a consequence of that death. And you know, I went on a number of the demonstrations that took place in Coventry last summer, and it is an undeniable fact that discrimination, inequality, poverty, housing, and so on are more concentrated among certain sections of society, particularly Black and Asian families, and that the treatment by the police to stop and search figures and other things are disproportionately affected. And I would support the demands to rectify those things. Again, I come back to the point that I think for all working people, public ownership, planning of the economy towards the needs of all with the best means. But there are specifics. So, for example, you know, the control of the police. At the moment, we've got this police crime courts and sentencing bill going through, which has got a large number of proposals, and it's 300 odd pages, but specifically on the rights to protest against the things that Black Lives Matter last summer, or more recently, the Women Against Violence demonstrations that took place, giving police powers to ban such protests where they are seriously annoying or causing an inconvenience. I just personally hope I can be seriously annoying for the rest of my life. But I would argue that we need to inject into those things. How should we run those institutions? How do you get from saying that the way in which police operate in certain areas amongst certain communities is wrong. If those areas and those communities don't have an element of control over the police, then they can't be rectified. Now, I was first elected as a county councillor for Labour 40 years ago. And when I was on the county council in the West Midlands for 4 years, the West Midlands Police was controlled through a police committee on the council. It was one committee that Labour never put me on in 4 years, but we'll leave that for the moment. And if you go further back in history, then police forces were controlled at effectively a local authority level through things called watch committees and so on. And I think we need to reopen that debate of taking the control of the police away from the Home Office and put it more into localised community control. I also think that there should be an element of elected control over the police, so that if you disagree with the priorities and the structures and the way in which the police are operating, you can elect somebody else rather than just leave them in place. So as well as supporting the Black Lives Matter demonstrations, in supporting analysis that recognises the discrimination that takes place and says that should be reversed, I also think there's an element of a debate which ought to have more priority, which is how should the police actually democratically controlled. I'm not anti-police. About 2 weeks ago, there was a bad road accident literally outside the window I'm looking through at the moment. And I went out and stopped traffic for 10 or 15 minutes till the police and the ambulances arrived. But once they were here, the public service role of the police is one that I fully support. However, I'm also what's known as a core participant in the undercover policing inquiry at the moment. I'm one of 11 Labour MPs or ex-Labour MPs who was spied on by MI5 and the Special Branch during the 70s, 80s and 90s, where 1,000 community justice, campaigning, environmental, animal rights, trade union campaigns were infiltrated by the police. And that's a role I think should be banned and stopped. And the files that were collected should be burnt and have a fresh start. So I want to encourage, and I'll have to piggyback this answer on the direct question you asked about Black Lives Matter, but as I say, I want to encourage a debate in all the campaigns that are against something. What should we put in its place? And in case of the police, it's democracy, it's accountability, it's an elected control where local communities have a decisive say.
So did they get anything on you? On the did they find anything on you?
Oh, you're back again. I don't know. I haven't seen the files yet, and this is such a long inquiry. It was announced in 2014, and Theresa May actually made it formal in 2015. So here we are 6 years later. It's cost £36 million so far. It's projected to cost £100 million when it finishes in another 3 or 4 years' time. At the moment, my case is scheduled to come up in 2023. But whether it gets delayed from that, I'm not sure.
Okay. How do you feel about giving baths to monuments like they did in Bristol?
Oh, I think there's plenty of those monuments that should come down, and I understand the anger, and it should immediately move on to a genuine consultation locally with proper historical exposure of the individuals that we've seen in monuments and that around the country, and let's redress the sort of history which the next generation learns, not by kowtowing. There's a word, kowtowing to the imperialists who are up on these statues, but having a genuine look at the real history, which is ordinary working people's history. So I fully understand what happened in Bristol. I also support the longer term campaigns as they've had in Oxford about the roads stuff and so on. And I think we should continue to push along that path and redress what is a poor period of history that only the imperialists who conquered economically or politically countries around the world in the name of Britain are the ones that are remembered, not the ordinary people, particularly the ordinary people's struggles. I mean, like the thing in the last couple of days about the War Graves Commission, admitting that there were tens of thousands, if not more, of service personnel from India who were effectively in mass graves with one little marker to it. There's lots of work still to be done in that area.
Okay. So we saw what happened with Jeremy Corbyn, his Labour leadership, and the kind of even without being elected Prime Minister, the kind of forces brought in against him. How do you hope that TUSC or any socialist movement would fare better against the establishment than a kind of a socialist-led Labour Party did?
Well, as I think I said before, I was supportive of Jeremy's radical policies, and as TUSC, we stood down from parliamentary contests in 2017 and 2019 because there was an arguable route towards social change and more socialist ideas coming to the front through the Labour Party under Jeremy's leadership. However, I think the organisational balance, particularly within Parliament, within council chambers, and within the various power structures within the Labour Party, were not changed at the same rate at which Jeremy was putting forward radical socialist policies, and that was a big factor in the success of the establishment's deposing of him. TUSC, as I say, has a certain internal democracy where we have a consensus approach and a veto, so we have harmony in the way that we're going forward. And let's be honest, we're not yet a threat to the establishment in the sense of having large numbers of people like, so we're not attacked in the same way. But if we were to emulate, for example, one of my if I have heroes, it's people like the 47 councillors in Liverpool in 83 to 86 who took on Thatcher and Tebbit and won tens of millions of pounds of extra funding for the city, built 5,000 houses, new sports centres, schools, parks, and so on. And they were viciously attacked because they challenged the status quo. There's a certain badge of honour if you're attacked in that way. And inevitably, whether it's an individual trade union leader, a Derek Robinson or an Arthur Scargill, whether it's a city like Liverpool and its Socialist Labour Council, a leader like Jeremy, if you threaten the establishment, you're going to get attacked. The only defence is a mass mobilisation of working people. In Liverpool, there were 50,000 extra people, I think in 1987 voted Labour, and then voted in 1983. So all the attacks against, and the personalised attacks against Tony Mulhern and Derek Hatton at the time in particular, because Liverpool people understood what the real battle was, and tens of thousands of them were involved in strike action in defence of their council, then it was water off a duck's back. When the establishment attacked people of Liverpool through Hillsborough, there is still 30 years on an active campaign to stop anybody publicly reading the Sun. If you've got working people motivated, then the attacks of the establishment can be resisted. As I say, TUSC isn't yet at the stage where the establishment probably looks at us as a threat, though if we were able to get large numbers of candidates elected, we'd probably go through the same process as other left and socialist campaigns and leaders have gone. Okay.
So in terms of TUSC and how it's run, you mentioned the steering committee and people sitting on the steering committee. How does positions on the steering committee decided? You said there was a seat for independent positions. How do they decide who holds that? How does that kind of stuff work?
A coalition, federally organised, operating on consensus, with the right of a veto to those on the steering committee. I've been as far as the Electoral Commission is concerned, I've been the nominated leader, and Clive Heemskirk, the national agent, and that's confirmed by the steering committee. The reps are decided, the RMT, for example, National Executive Committee members come to represent the RMT, Socialist Party and Resist send their own reps. The individual members, we have and had in February, at the end of the policy conference, a section for the individual members to elect their representative. So it's a direct one member, one vote for the individual representative, but the organisations decide their own representative according to their own procedures. So we're, as I say, a collective, a consensus, but with the right of a veto. So we only progress, and it might be a bit slow for some people, but we only progress at the speed at which we're all comfortable with.
Okay, so obviously over the years we've had all sorts of kind of left-wing projects, left-wing parties, and you guys have been going for a little while. What do you think is going to enable you to be successful in future, where other people have failed perhaps in the past?
Well, I think as I've said previously, the Corbyn era in the Labour Party is over. The Starmer era is consolidating itself, and more people have left the Labour Party. 100,000 is a not unreasonable estimate as those who've left in the last 12 months. And there's an urgent need for somewhere for not only those people, but newer layers coming into struggle, whether it be on environmental or Black Lives Matter or trade union struggles and so on, to feel that they've got a political voice. So there's an urgent need. As to whether which organisation can fill that need depends both on their structures and their policies. And I think the way in which we operate with a consensus core policy and a consensus on the steering committee with the right of veto is a protection against any one part of that project having a decisive say. And my union, I think I mentioned earlier on, Unite, has reduced its funding to the Labour Party by 10%. The CWU, the Postal Union, and the Fire Brigades Union, the FBU, apparently considering the same. The Bakers Union had a consultation in January and February, and only 9% of their members thought that the Keir Starmer-led Labour Party was actually representing them. So there's a travel from certain layers of the trade union movement, but we're not precious that TUSC is the finished article, either in policies or in structures. If that promise of a conference of the left, which Lenny McCluskey, my Union General Secretary, spoke of last summer, came about, and it got the 6 or 7 left-led trade unions together, and then it got socialists inside and outside the Labour Party together. In other words, a bigger version of what Bob Crow did in 2009. There may well come out of that something bigger and wider than TUSC is at the moment, which I would welcome. And I would hope that TUSC would be able to play a role in that. So it's not an answer that says we are the finished model and we will grow because of X. I think we are the best answer at the moment to the need for an anti-austerity electoral challenge, but to create a mass party with memberships in tens or hundreds of thousands and a reach to a wider electoral base of millions, in other words, to challenge the existing parties, is going to take bigger organisations than we are. It's going to take the trade unions to come to that decision. And that's part of our role, is to argue that, is to argue there needs to be something bigger and better than TUSC is. We're pace setters, perhaps, flag markers, or whatever the phrase would be. We're not the finished article.
Okay. I mean, isn't there a danger that organisations like TUSC, and this is the accusation that's being levelled a lot, I hear levelled a lot against all sorts of projects on the left, is only just going to split the vote, and with the end result is which could have more Tories in power?
I could be cynical and say, would you spot the difference? If there's £15.9 billion less coming to local councils now than there was 10 years ago, there's two halves to that. It's not just that a Tory government has changed the economics nationally, it's that existing Labour councils have not fought back locally. And therefore they are both complicit in the fact we've lost 750,000 local government jobs. And that's not just an academic figure. It means 750,000 people leaving school don't have the chance for a public sector pension or a public sector sick pay scheme and relatively decent wages, a career to look forward to, because there hasn't been the resistance. In the mid-1980s, there were 20 Labour councils who in 1983 said to Margaret Thatcher, we're not having these cuts. Now, it's another discussion, what was their means of resisting and why was only Liverpool and Lambeth left at the end of that and so on. but there's not even 20 Labour councillors who you could say on a Labour authority have voted against the budget at the end of February, which implies another round of cuts in the following financial year. So what vote are we splitting? I think we're the only anti-austerity vote. Are we splitting the pro-austerity vote? Possibly and hopefully. But there isn't loads of people out there standing against austerity. I wish it were otherwise. As I say, with 330 candidates, and I think there's about 7,000 or 8,000 council seats up, something like that. We are the biggest on the left, standing against austerity. And we're probably standing in one in every 22 and whatever the maths is of seats that are available. So we're not actually splitting much. We are trying to say there needs to be a bigger challenge to austerity. And if more joined it, but I will make this point, I wrote to the SLP in Hartlepool, are you thinking of standing in the Hartlepool by-election? We wrote to Anna Rothery in Liverpool, are you thinking of standing an independent? Over the last 10 years, every time we've stood in elections, we've wrote to local Labour candidates saying, what's your policy on the council budget and austerity? Because if you're against it, we won't stand against it. We don't want to split a real anti-austerity vote, but we don't see much of it at the moment. You're silent again, I'm afraid.
I'm trying to control the unruly internet. So just to wrap things up, why do you think people should support TUSC?
Well, because I think we're a stage along a necessary debate for the creation of a new, genuine political voice for working people. We will, even if our votes are modest, at least force a bit of an argument in 100 towns, cities and counties over whether the next year's budget should be the same as the last 10 years and the continuation of austerity, or should we actually be organising to get back off a rich country and a government that can find £400 billion largely in business support during the pandemic, putting back into local authorities the funds necessary to reopen libraries, reopen community centres, youth centres and so on. We will be arguing in these elections for, as Liverpool did in the mid-1980s, for a consultation with local people on what the needs of the local communities are, and then putting forward a needs-based budget. And if there isn't the funds in the local council, though in many cases with reserves and borrowing powers, they could do far more than they're doing at the moment, for building social housing or restoring those services that have been lost. And let's have a concerted effort, starting with all Labour councils meeting together and putting forward to the government a demand for the reintroduction of local finance sufficient to protect working people's lives, and in fact to extend it. So, without making this answer too long, we've been arguing in recent months that the question of track and test, track and trace of the pandemic shouldn't be given to the Sercos and the Capitals of this world. It should be run by local authorities with local NHS facilities, because they're not only the people who know the areas the best, they're actually based locally right from the beginning, not in a call centre hundreds of miles away. So we will be putting socialist responses to the current COVID crisis, but also challenging particularly the decade of austerity. And even if you don't think we're going to win a particular seat, every vote we get in the election is a slight movement further down the road of that debate. And in some cases, it might even make one or two people still in the Labour Party think, well, perhaps these guys have got some idea out there. I should be doing that in here. I can't predict exactly how in each local area each result will have a different effect. All I can say is there needs to be a debate against austerity. TUSC is offering that debate, and I think it's worthy of a vote if you're in an area where we have to be standing.
Sorry, I'm muted again. Thanks for that. Thanks for all that, Dave, and good luck in the elections.
Thanks very much for having me.